What is the strangest thing you do at others' houses because of practice? Story 1. I used to have a job that rented a lot of houses and properties in Southern California. Part of my job was meeting with property owners and to close a deal with them. One day I went to this man's house in Laguna Beach, as his house was on the beach. I was meeting with an insanely wealthy but also insanely nice Asian man who I had met a couple of times before, and we had somewhat of a work-type relationship. As I begin to bring up the deal to be made, he suggests we walk to the beach first. I was ready to get home. It was Saturday, so we start walking, talking about life, etc. He then proceeded to hold my hand, interlocked finger style, for the whole walk. I was originally wowed by it, but when I brought it up to a coworker, he said it's just a part of their culture. He also made me wear his personal house slippers to be allowed entry into his home. Just cultural differences, but it still cracks me up that the most romantic beach walk I've ever had in my life was with a 75-yo-something man millionaire. Story 2. I was invited to my friend's grandmother's home for Thanksgiving. I was new to the area and I had no family near, so I graciously accepted. My buddy Jason gave me the breakdown of his extended family that was going to be in attendance. His parents were divorced but would both be attending. His grandparents were married but legally separated and lived apart, but grandfather would attending. His uncle Carl would be there with his mail-order bride and their young son. His other uncle Ted was openly gay and battling AIDS. He and his lover would also be there. So I have set the stage. You can probably picture all of them in your mind. In person, it exceeded my imagination. Ted's boyfriend wore cowboy chaps to dinner. They were all very colorful and animated. The pre-dinner discussions were riveting. As we were seated for the meal, Jason's grandmother Sarah took out an Altoids tin, took two and began passing it around the table. I watched as everyone took 1-2 and immediately took them and washed them down with a drink. Jason got the tin and did the same. As we were seated for the meal, Jason's grandmother Sarah took out an Altoids tin, took two and began passing it around the table. I watched as everyone took 1-2 and immediately took them and washed them down with a drink. Jason got the tin and did the same. I asked him, "Why is everyone swallowing Altoids before supper?" They all laughed. He said, "Oh, these are Valium. We learned several years ago that as we gather for Thanksgiving we drank and arguments ensued. So one year my uncle said, we should all just take a Valium at the beginning of the meal so we can all just chill the f*** out." They all laughed hysterically and agreed. I passed on the offer and handed the tin to Jason's mom as next in line. And as the evening played out, they all essentially zoned out during dinner. No fights transpired, and they considered it a successful Thanksgiving. I would have never imagined this would happen, but it was a fun experience. Story 3. I worked for a rental car company in an Orthodox Jewish community. A customer rushed in on a Friday evening and asked to be driven home immediately because if we didn't make it to his house by sundown, he would have to get out of the car and walk the rest of the way due to the Sabbath. He used an app on his phone to tell him the exact time of sundown each day. I didn't have a driver available, so I just told him to go home and I'll come by his house later to grab the car. A half hour later, I arrived at his house. Husband is nowhere to be found, and the following scenario ensues with his wife. My husband left the keys on our bedside table and I'm not allowed to touch them. Can you come in and grab them, please? I awkwardly follow her into her bedroom and grab them from the bedside table. Can I ask one more favor? Do you mind unplugging the house for me? I then follow her into her basement and enter a room where there are literally 15-20 different electrical cords coming through holes in the walls and ceiling, and through a tangled series of different outlet strips are all consolidated into one master plug going into a standard wall outlet. She points at it and asks me to unplug it. I do. She thanks me. I leave. I had a lot of wild experiences in 5 years working that job. This one was definitely in the top 5. Story 4. I went over to a friend's house for a sleepover, and when I changed into my pajamas, her mom started demanding I put something else on and throw my pajamas out. I was really confused. She was yelling about how my pajamas were sinful and bore signs of the devil. I ended up just calling my mom to take me home because I was so uncomfortable, but that woman just kept scolding us for allowing me to wear satanic symbols. The symbols on my pajamas? Peace signs. She said they were broken crosses, so clearly a sign of the devil. Story 5. When I was in primary school, I made a new friend from Hong Kong. One day she came over to my house for a play date, and when her parents came to pick her up in the evening, my parents invited them all to stay for dinner at ours. They were new immigrants to Australia, and I guess my parents thought they might not have many friends or family here. Anyway, they politely declined and said they didn't want to impose. My parents insisted it was no imposition at all, but they again declined, saying they didn't want to be rude and intrude on our family. We were kind of taken aback, but just assumed maybe they had their own dinner waiting at home and were too polite to say, so we saw them off. My friend later explained that her parents thought my parents weren't being genuine and were only asking out of politeness, and the fact that our parents didn't press the issue further was proof that we didn't really want them there. It's not weird, but I thought it was an interesting contrast even as a kid. In the West, when someone offers you hospitality, it's seen as a genuine and voluntary gesture, and it'd be rude to turn it down. Whereas in some cultures, the offer of hospitality is seen as a compulsory courtesy, but not necessarily always genuinely meant, so it's impolite to accept it immediately. In the West, it would be impolite to keep insisting after someone's already declined an offer. But in other cultures, you're expected to press the issue a bit and keep insisting to give them a chance to accept if they want to without appearing rude. Story 6. Worked nights for a while. Rented a house in a suburban area with a heavy Jewish population. One morning at 8 a.m. I got a knock at the door. Got home from work at 4 a.m. So, I'm instantly annoyed. So annoyed that I answer the door in my boxers. 3 little kids all look up at me. I sighed heavily and used the door to cover my nearly naked body. They squeaked up, "Can you turn off our fire?" At first, I thought to tell them to just call the police, and then said, "Wait, do you mean your stove?" Was answered in the affirmative. I quickly got dressed, went over and knocked on the door. The wife of the house opened the door and quickly pulled me in by my shirt. I looked around quickly, and there was very little furniture in the house. Their kitchen table was a folding table with a plastic chair and a bunch of men around it talking about the Islamic Brotherhood. The wife asked me to press one button on her electric stove, did it, then was very briskly pushed out of the house. I understand their religious practices. Still weird. Story 7. I went over to my friend's house to play D&D in high school, and my friend's mom made lunch for the 7 of us. It was really good. We were just playing D&D and eating tacos, and after we all finished the lunch, everyone started pulling out cash. I was super confused. My friend turned to me and asked, "Do you have your $5?" So apparently we were supposed to pay for the meal. I was incredibly embarrassed. One of my other friends ended up paying for me. I never played D&D at that house ever again. Edit. This happened in Sokol. They were just a standard American household as far as I was aware. The food was homemade. D&D is Dungeons and Dragons. It's a role-playing game. Also, I can confirm that my friend was not taking the money. I literally saw him give it to his mom. Story 8. I didn't personally experience this because I left the one time they tried to force me, but my friend's parents, mainly her super ultra Christian preacher stepfather, made her shower with a bathing suit on because he believed the only time you should be naked is when changing or to reproduce or when a man wants sex, otherwise you'll be too tempted by your own lust, and nakedness invites the devil in. This poor girl hadn't bathed naked in years, and we were in middle school. She never smelled cause she would rub soap through the bathing suit, but she had yeast infections all the time if I remember right. I started inviting her to my house as often as I could just so she could properly shower. Unfortunately, her life hasn't been easy. We haven't spoken in years, but I think about her sometimes. Her parents were raising her to be the perfect Christian housewife. They monitored everything she did. She developed a horrible eating disorder because they told her no one would love her if she was even chubby, and that she was letting the devil win if she ever indulged. She was expected to take care of the house, despite being the youngest child, as according to them, God designed women to be housewives. They refused to let her attend sex ed and basically told her when the time comes her future husband's pleasure is the only thing that matters, that he will teach her what to do. They refused to even let her use tampons because they believed it would deflower her. She was always happy to be able to use them instead of bulky pads. I gave her the locker combo for my locker and showed her a little baggie of tampons she could get whenever she needed them. She was scared her controlling parents would check her locker and find them. They did regularly check it. Her mom was a coach at the school, so they stayed in mine. I ended up having to teach her and encouraged her to eat more. The encouragement didn't work that great, so instead I would bring her smoothies loaded with as many vitamins and calories that I could hide in it. I'm talking about using heavy cream instead of milk. She had it in her head that smoothies couldn't possibly have a lot of calories. I know it's not right to purposely deceive someone into eating something, but she was literally fainting from just walking because her body was so weak. I was a kid who didn't have any other resources to help. She did seem to get a little better once I started giving her the smoothies. She ended up lashing out at her parents, having risked and ultimately ended up in a car wreck that caused pretty extensive brain damage. The wreck killed 2 other people. My old friend was still in high school, and a teacher had been driving while texting on the way to school. Her seatbelt failed and she went through the windshield but somehow survived. She had a long road to recovery but has gained most function back from what I've heard. Her childhood was tragic and very damaging, but I love seeing the cute pictures of her with her girlfriend living far away from her awful family. We drifted apart when I moved away. Story 9. When I was 11, I stayed at my aunt's house over the school holidays with my 13-year-old brother. She had a rule that we couldn't watch any TV shows that she considered impressionable. That meant no cartoons, namely Dragon Ball Z and Pokemon. We missed the end of the Cell Saga. My brother was pissed. He hasn't let it go to this day, over 20 years later. Story 10. Drank slightly chocolatey water for a month. I think this counts. Years back, I was prospecting for a field site on a very remote island in the South Pacific. It was sufficiently remote that having me in the neighborhood was something of a spectacle, so as I made trips out to villages from my home village, I was fated along the way. I'd get to a village and the local headman and I would get to talking and they'd have a nice feast. These guys aren't entirely cut off from the world, so one nice trade good they had was powdered milk and Ovaltine. On arriving at the second village, I noticed that they weren't exactly well-to-do, but out came the Ovaltine. Not wanting to use up their supplies, I foolishly interrupted the preparation to tell them that was enough. They looked confused but handed over water with just a bit of Ovaltine floating at the top. It was wretched, but trying to be polite, I drank it all and smiled. Word got around, so every village I went to thereafter was informed of my preference. Couldn't exactly correct them at this point as somebody might have been insulted, so I drank it. Kinda wonder if the next visitor benefited from my blunders in protocol. Story 11. I guess this qualifies as culture. My sister was dating a man that had been raised in a nudist colony. He took her to meet his family at their house at the colony. She was a tad surprised when his mother immediately said, "There is a hook on the bathroom door for your clothes." My sister proceeds to spend the entire evening naked with his folks. Her BF had told her before they went that it would be her option, but I guess his parents didn't think so. Story 12. I had a neighborhood friend that I played on the street with and at school sometimes. Her mom and dad always told me I wasn't allowed to be in the same room as my friend's older brothers because seeing young women was a sin for unmarried men. I was 10 at the most. The youngest of her older brothers was 16. When I was asked by my friend to sleep over for her birthday, I was told by her and her mother that I needed to remain in my friend's bedroom. Her mother would bring us food and drinks and take us to the bathroom whenever it was safe. I told my sister about it the next day and she told me I wasn't allowed to go near their house or my friend again. To this day, I still don't know if it was actually due to culture or religion or if maybe they just had a really weird family. Story 13. I'm German and I had several weird interactions during my travels, but I guess the weird ones were the hosts, not me. The way I was culturally socialized is to talk to people very blunt and direct. Say what you mean only kinda style. So when I was traveling, especially in Asia, there were several situations where people, for example, invited me to come in and have dinner or offered a cup of tea or coffee or a snack. And when I felt like it, I simply agreed and said, "Yeah, sure, sounds great." In more than one situation, I could tell by the looks on their face that they 100% expected me to politely decline and did not really want to invite me for these things. So there were several situations where I sat in other people's houses, had food or a drink while they were visibly uncomfortable, which then made me uncomfortable, but of course it was too late to pull back. So, yeah, it would be easier when people just offered stuff they really meant to and not offer something you don't want out of politeness. In Germany, if you don't want anyone in your home, you simply not ask them. You say goodbye at the doorstep and close the door. Nobody would be pissed or feel alienated. And on the other hand, when you invite someone and you really feel like it and want the other one to agree, nobody would say no out of politeness and then expect to be asked again. Story 14. A few years ago, we were visiting family after Halloween, and my husband was entertaining our toddler nephew by goofing around with this silly little witch hat that had been part of a costume. He was popping it on and off his own head, the baby's head, etc. My 5-year-old niece from the other side of the family walked by and he jokingly popped it on her head. She ripped it off, threw it to the ground, and began screeching, "My heart belongs to Jesus. Witchcraft is the work of the devil. I invited Jesus into my heart." I've never seen a 5-year-old act like that before. You could have heard a pin drop in the room after that. We knew that her mother had been becoming more and more aligned with some fringe religious groups, but that really brought home how far things had gone. Story 15. One of my exes had an uncle who was disabled. He was on a wheelchair. He was also a Catholic church priest, and that's how I found out that in my country, if you are a disabled priest, you can get permission to do a whole mass in your own house. So whenever I happened to visit on Sunday, I would have to take part in a half-an-hour-long mini-mass in the living room. It was pretty much literally the same thing as in church, just on a small scale with only me, my ex, her parents, and her grandmother. Grandmother would be the one to help turn the living room table into a temporary altar before the mass. You know, put down the ceremonial clothes. Take out that gold mug and gold bowl for that Jesus wafer, etc. Also, since you are not allowed to take the wine and the wafer if you are in a state of sin, the uncle would do confessions in the living room before the mass. Story 16. I was on holiday and spent a day with a friend in Japan, and he told me to come back to his place for dinner. We grabbed some takeaway burgers and went to his house. When we got there, his parents weren't home, so he said we couldn't eat until we arrived. Fair enough, I thought he must have got burgers for them too. 2 hours later, they arrive. They had a quick chat in Japanese, and then I asked if they wanted to eat with us. He asked them that. They looked confused and responded to him. I asked him what they said, and he said they said it's ridiculous that we waited for them before eating. Story 17. Okay, this doesn't really compare to a lot of these other stories, but after my first year at university, I went to visit a new friend for a weekend over the summer. Her parents lived about 45 minutes away from my parents, so we thought it would be fun. Her house was a partially hoarded mess, which honestly wasn't the weirdest part. My parents were borderline hoarders themselves. The house had 3 bedrooms upstairs for their family of 6. But none of the kids' bedrooms had doors, all removed off the hinges. My friend thought it was no big deal. Her dad had taken them off ages ago, etc., not as some sort of punishment or anything like that. This is in a house with 3 teenaged or college-aged girls. I was totally creeped out by it. The other weird thing was when 6 of us, me, friend, a couple of siblings, and her parents loaded into the car to travel to some event that was a pretty long drive away, maybe an hour, and I started chatting to my friend. She looked at me shocked, like I had committed a mortal sin, and quietly whispered to me that you're not supposed to talk in the car. Ever? Everyone but Dad, who was driving, obediently whipped out a book and started reading. They offered me one, but my car sick couldn't handle that, so I just stared out the window. It was so bizarre. Again, she acted like she had no clue this was weird and unique to her little family. The more I reflect on it and the things she told me over the years, the more it feels like she grew up in an abusive household ruled by a man who imposed weird, controlling rules upon the entire household that no one challenged. Dad was a brilliant, benevolent leader. Story 18. Stayed at this kid's house who I knew but not too well. His older sister was friends with my older sister, and they were having some sort of sleepover at my house, and the brother asked me if I wanted to sleep over at his house. So to get to the story, I go there and already I feel weird about the whole thing. I don't know why I remember this specific detail, but I remember the house being all dimly lit. It just felt weird at the time. We play in his room, and then like an hour later his parents call him for dinner and he makes me wait in there while he goes to eat with his family. I remember being freaking hungry too, but I was like 8, so I didn't speak up. After dinner we continued playing, and at some point during the night I coughed, probably only once too. Yet his psycho parents who heard it immediately jump into action. They assume I am sick, and from then on, they keep me separated from him, so I spent the rest of the night alone sleeping on their couch. I remember so badly wanting to go home. In the morning while they ate breakfast and did not offer me anything, I immediately called my sister to come pick me up. Parents were out of town. I had never been so happy to leave their house. I was supposed to stay at this kid's house for the entire weekend. It was one of the worst experiences ever for an 8-year-old kid. Lol. Here's another terrible one that is more in line with the theme of the thread though. So I am friends with this one kid in our apartment building. One night he invited me to go with his family to night church. Not being religious and also being like 9 or 10 years old and curious, I think cool and say yes. Anyway, to keep this story short, the night church was a Pentecostal church. If you are unaware what that means, it's the type of church where people speak in tongues and shit like that. The minister, or whatever you call them, would touch people on their heads and then they would act like they were being possessed. They'd flop on the ground, start speaking nonsense, etc. I'd look over at my friend and his family and they'd be completely into it. I was thinking, how is this the same kid I am friends with? This is weird. I remember being extremely uncomfortable and wanting to leave so bad. But this is the 90s and I'm probably around 10 years old. I basically have no way to leave. I just have to wait till the service is over and my friend's family drives me home. Like the first story, I could not wait to get home and out of there. It was such a creepy experience.